towards that.
And empathy.
But a lot of them have ended up homeless. And they've ended up homeless over here as well. I mean, I knew someone who was in the army who ended up homeless because they just can't deal with normal civilian lifestyle, and that, which is also traumatic. Traumatic to go from one environment to another that you don't know how to handle yourself in. It goes back to not having control. Because when in the army, you're told what to do, when to eat. There's a structure, there's a pattern, there's a rhythm, there's a ritual, or whatever you want to call it. And when that's taken away from you and you're put into a civilian lifestyle where you've got to now fend for yourself,
same as prison.
It is. And it's one thing that people aren't aware, which is going forward, is I'm in the great belief that we are becoming more... So we're going to have to become more self-reliant. Although there's a lot of political momentum towards political correctness and social justice and things like this, I think that's going to be all talk from now, because I'm very unrealistic and very unlikely for it to happen, because the pattern that we're actually seeing now in all these future at work think tanks is that we are going to have to become more self-reliant on ourselves to operate, which means we're not going to have that level of control of working for a company. We're going to have to learn for ourselves. So people who actually have this control of a system while at school and everything, and told what to do, when to do it, they haven't been taught how to be able to become self-reliant in the outside world, which is why the people who will succeed are the people who probably rebelled more at school, who did not conform to a system.
Well, it's about integration, isn't it? And that's what they discovered in terms of drug addicts, and they, as you know, Norway, Sweden, Portugal, they've decided to legalize everything and integrate people instead of putting them in prison. And the same has been said for army veterans. The important thing is to integrate them, and you'll find that they're less likely to become drug addicts, even if they were using drugs as they were in Vietnam.
But everyone needs structure. We all need structure.
Which brings us back to OCD. You see, and that it's something incredibly common, and it's a big spectrum. So, for instance, how many times have you suddenly become religious under stress? So many people will cross themselves when they're anxious or stressed. Do they really believe that it's going to make a practical smidgen of difference, or do they do it?
Well, not in the model of your world,
because they think they should. Well, some people will, some people won't, and that is again an example of. Some people may do it because they genuinely believe. That's obsessive. Some people do it because they know it probably won't, but it gives them some form of solace.
Hope gives them hope.
But because it's not real, they have to do it again and again and again, and that's obsession. That's obsessional. So one is ego syntonic, you really believe it, the other is ego dystonic.
I think this is an area where I'm not going to say we're going to disagree on, but it's an area that is really open to interpretation. And here's why. Because the thing is, if people do it over and over again in that respect, it could very well be OCD, but it could also be very much at the fact that if they want to believe in God and they feel God is not answering their prayers, they will keep on doing it.
Well, that's right. And you see that
so they're using God as a crutch.
And I'm giving this as an example of action, just so people can relate to it. You're right. I mean, some people do it because they genuinely believe it. Other people do it because they're looking for some kind of support and they're willing to do anything, although they know it doesn't really work. But in that second, they get a little bit of solace. But you can see how it would suddenly, if normal people, and not in quotes, do it, you can see how we're all skating, some of us, on the boundaries of OCD. How you might feel that you have to turn on the lights in a certain order or turn them off in a certain order, because a certain amount of structure in whatever profession you do does give you security and orderliness. But the difficulty is OCD can be incredibly disabling. I've known patients who it takes 8 hours to get ready in the morning, because if they break their ritual, they've got to start all over again.
That sounds like my teenage daughter, actually. It's not as bad as 8 hours.
And then you've got the obsessional thoughts, which can be incredibly frightening and unpleasant. Now, the important thing to anyone listening to this to understand is that it is 99.9% recurring that you'll never act on your obsessional thoughts. So be reassured by that however unpleasant your obsessional thoughts are, you're not going to act on it. That's what the research has shown.
Because there's two types of OCD from one. There's the OCD that people understand as turning on the lights 100 times or whatever.
And there's the obsessional thought.
And which is known as pure OCD, isn't it? I think it's been termed, that's what. By the way, guys, I looked on YouTube for some of this information, so it may not be entirely accurate.
It's predominantly obsessions or predominantly compulsions.
Right. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So in terms, but I want to go on to the broader section because I mean, while it affects 2.5 million people, not everyone who's listening is going to really be concerned too much about OCD in their lives.
But remember, we're talking about an irrational anxiety, and we've already said that it's chronic. We've said that a third of the population have irrational anxiety with respect to some form of trauma. In fact, half of women with birth. Then we have phobias, which again, at least half of us have some form of phobia, irrational anxiety. I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it. That's an irrational fear. And if you avoid, then you feel better, and your brain back translates and says, well, if I avoid and feel better, that must mean it's proof it's bad. Mm-hmm. And the brain does anything to avoid anxiety. All our behavior is constantly focused on reducing our anxiety, and nature designed us to reflexly, to instinctively reduce anxiety, because that's the quickest way of surviving. Because when you see a tiger, you don't think, you just run. That's instinct to reduce your anxiety. It's why seemingly clever people do stupid things, such as addictions, because it's instinctive. There's a lack of volitional, conscious thought.
It's interesting. It's one thing we were talking about earlier before we actually started this podcast, while we were just chilling and enjoying a cup of coffee, is that
and the
I actually said,
croissant.
And the thing is, I'm not naive enough to believe that I'm always right, because I'm not. By any stretch of the imagination, but I am aware of how I feel about certain things, and I always don't know why. But one of the things we were discussing was heroin, and I said I can't understand how people who not that I don't understand. It's almost like I have a little tolerance of people who become addicted to heroin, because someone's at some point got to make a decision to put heroin in a syringe and shoot it up their arm, or stick it in a vein and shoot it up their arm. Now, I'm probably quite fortunate that I've never been in a position, but I'd like to, I wouldn't like to think. I've been through some pretty rough times in my life and decisions where it's easier to hit the bottle, because my father did it enough times. But I chose not to. And that comes down to what's called cause and effect. I looked at the cause, and the effect of that for me was not to go and stick heroin up my arm. It was not to go and hit the bottle, but it was actually to dig in deep and actually man up a little bit. So I quite have little tolerance for people who take things like heroin. It
depends on the backgrounds as well, though. Right? So, for instance, adolescents are. Their frontal lobes, which is the front part of their brain, which is to do with planning and spontaneity and assessment of risk, that is reduced. That isn't matured yet. So, for instance, the research shows that, adolescents are much more likely to admit to crimes they didn't do to police, because they don't assess the risks of actually admitting to it. They just think they're going to get out of trouble then, because the police do the good cop, bad cop routine. So an adolescent may think it's a bit of fun. They might not assess the consequences properly of shooting up with heroin. Then there's your mental state. You might be suffering from mood swings, depressed, and then you want to feel better, or anxiety, where again you want to feel better and you do things reflexly. And then there's peer pressure. And for example, your girlfriend or boyfriend might be doing it, and you think, well, if they're doing it, then there's nothing wrong with it.
I understand peer pressure. Look, I'm no saint by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I went to school. It's a good job I'm not going in politics, otherwise I'd never get elected. But I probably, I took marijuana, and yes, I did inhale it. And in terms of a recreational, something which is quite mild, but then again, where's the line? Where's the line between something like marijuana and something like heroin? And I can't decide. But the thing is, I looked at the consequences of me taking marijuana at the time, and I look at the consequences of what would happen to me if I took something like heroin or crystal meth, for example, and. Long term, it's not going to produce me. It's not going to give me a positive outcome.
It's easy to see how things can act as a gateway, because remember, none of this is a real need. People are chasing their dopamine hit, and you get your dopamine hit from anything. You can get it from going to the gym. You can get it from social media. You can get it from drugs.
But it all comes down to one thing: instant gratification.
That's it. And because it's not real, then you can take your cannabis. That might not do the job. You take your heroin. That might not do the job. You take your crack. That might not do the job. What do? You get more and more extreme because it's not a real solution.
So what is the solution?
Okay, well, now we're talking about... we're going full circle, obviously, because we're talking about anxiety disorders.
Anxiety, OCD, I'm asking for a solution.
Okay, there's a couple of things. There's a combination of... The gold standard is a combination of medication and therapy. You did say that there's a lack of serotonin, and you're right. There's a group of medications called SSRI, serotonin-specific reuptake inhibitors, which are used to treat irrational anxieties. You might not need it. It's good to try. It depends. You need to get professionally assessed by a licensed practitioner, obviously, but cognitive behavior therapy is the gold standard therapy for irrational fears. And what it does, it's a sequence of sessions where you get exposed to your fear, either your thought or your compulsion, in a graded process, say from your least anxiety provoking. So for instance, if you're afraid of, say, a cup of coffee, then your least anxiety provoking could be a distant picture of a cup of coffee, and your most anxiety provoking could be holding a cup of coffee and drinking it. Now, that is cognitive behavior therapy. What I do is a therapy of rapid reprocessing, and the original psychologist called Shapiro developed something called eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is a therapy where she moves her vertical finger in front of your eyes and gets you to think about what it is that you're anxious about. And she originally developed it after a walk in the woods when she had some problems on her mind, and she realized that at the end of a walk she'd solved them, and she thought to herself, well, how come this is the case? Was it somehow my eyes being distracted as I was thinking and feeding back through my optic nerves into my brain and somehow processing it? So her vertical finger is the metaphorical tree trunk. And they've done lots of research. It does work, but they figured out you don't need the finger. You can have alternate flashing lights. You can have a patella hammer hitting someone's knees alternately. And I've studied that technique with also going to an NLP course, which Paul McKenna actually taught. And I saw him do his own version. And then I developed my own rapid reprocessing.
What did Paul McKenna do?
He did his own style of that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay.
What it is this, to explain it in a nutshell. When you're anxious about anything, remember we said these are problems when the fear is irrational. Now, you have two types of anxiety. You've got your logical anxiety, where you know something's dangerous. So, for instance, if you're going to go into a shark cage, you know that you're dealing with something very dangerous. And the way to reduce your anxiety is education, and is arming yourself with the facts and learning how to deal with it. So that's how you deal with logical anxiety. With irrational anxiety, then no amount of education is really going to help you, because it's irrational in the first place. And your mind, remember, does anything to avoid anxiety. So as soon as it thinks of it, it avoids it. And avoiding makes it feel better, so it back translates and says, well, it must be bad. If avoiding it is good, then facing it must be bad. Now, what the rapid reprocessing does is it makes you face up to it. in a situation, in a controlled, careful situation where we look at everything to give you calm and